Alice McRae had never been the type of person to chase loud ambitions or glittering promises of a grand life. She preferred quiet spaces, long stretches of time in which her hands could work with clay, and the kind of solitude that was filled not with loneliness but with a sense of being rooted. When her father passed away the previous year, leaving her the old family home on the outskirts of Seldwell County, she felt a mix of grief and relief. Grief at losing the only steady figure who had quietly supported her. Relief because the house represented continuity, something that grounded her after years of wandering between rented apartments in crowded cities. The house itself was modest, a single-story structure with wide windows that faced a meadow where wildflowers pushed through the grass, and behind it a narrow time-worn gravel road stretched toward the main highway. That driveway had been there for decades, laid down in her grandfather's time, never paved but always reliable. A strip of stone that wound between two properties and ended right at the wooden gate leading to her yard. Alice knew from old maps and papers that the land had been measured properly, that the road was hers even if it looked like it skirted the boundary of the lot next door. The neighbor, Karen Tillis, lived in a house that could not have been more different from Alice's. Karen's place was a two-story colonial revival, meticulously painted in cream and forest green, with perfectly pruned rose bushes lining the walkway and an iron mailbox polished to a shine. Karen herself was in her late 60s, always appearing in pressed blouses, pearl earrings, and a manner that suggested she considered herself the guardian of the neighborhood's dignity. When Alice arrived that spring with a truck full of boxes and her pottery wheel carefully strapped in the back, Karen had come over almost immediately with a basket of muffins and a peculiar smile, the kind that felt rehearsed rather than warm. She welcomed Alice to the community. Yet within minutes her gaze drifted toward the gravel road and she remarked, almost casually, that driveways in the area had always been a point of confusion. Alice thanked her for the muffins and brushed off. The comment, reminding herself that older neighbors often had their own sense of entitlement, and she preferred not to start a conflict on her first week in the new house. In the following days, Alice settled into a rhythm that was both soothing and invigorating. She converted the sunroom into a workspace where light fell generously across her clay table, set up shelves for her glazes, and filled the air with the earthy scent of wet stoneware. The road leading to her house, though rough and in need of fresh gravel, felt like an extension of her daily ritual. Every evening after finishing her work, she would walk along it, picking up stray branches, imagining how she would one day restore the driveway properly with new stone, maybe even install lanterns along the side to create a welcoming path. It gave her a sense of ownership and belonging. Yet, almost every time she was outside, she could sense Karen's presence across the hedge, a figure watching with narrowed eyes, sometimes watering her plants but always lingering just long enough for Alice to notice. One afternoon, while Alice was unloading clay from her car, Karen appeared again, this time without muffins, her tone edged with authority. She mentioned that some years ago the county had reviewed land boundaries in the area, and that, technically, the road might fall on her side. Alice replied politely but firmly that she had studied the deed and county plat maps before moving in, and everything confirmed the driveway was within her property lines. Karen nodded, though the smile she offered was thin, and she left without further comment. Still, the encounter left a residue of unease. Alice told herself it was nothing more than neighborly nosiness, yet she caught herself replaying the words at night, wondering why someone would bring up such a matter if there was not some ulterior motive. Spring rolled into early summer, and the meadow behind Alice's house burst into green. Her ceramics began selling steadily online, and she started to feel that her life had found its balance at last. But the quiet was fragile. A surface stretched tight over something she could not yet name. The driveway, once simply a strip of gravel connecting her home to the world beyond, began to feel like the stage for a silent contest of ownership. Karen's words, her lingering looks, her oddly timed appearances, all suggested that what Alice considered hers might not remain uncontested. And so the introduction to her new life in Seldwell carried with it the faint but unmistakable pulse of conflict, one that lay in the soil beneath her feet and in the gaze of the neighbor who had already marked her territory with roses and suspicion. It was early on a Tuesday morning when Alice was woken by a low, grinding sound, something heavy moving against stone, a mechanical growl that seemed out of place in the stillness of her quiet street. She sat up in bed, disoriented, thinking at first it was distant road work, but the vibrations soon grew stronger, rattling the frame of her window. Pulling on a sweater, she hurried to the porch, and what she saw made her stop in shock. A large, yellow bulldozer crouched at the edge of her gravel driveway, its blade already carving into the earth, peeling away the stones in wide, merciless swaths. Dust rose into the air, mixing with the morning light, while two men in hard hats directed the machine with practiced indifference. Standing just beyond them, arms crossed as if supervising a project she herself had commissioned, was Karen Tillis. Her floral blouse fluttered in the wind, her hair neatly set as always, and the look on her face was not one of hostility but of triumph, as though this was an outcome long awaited. Alice ran across the lawn, waving her arms, shouting over the roar of the engine, demanding to know what they were doing. One of the workers cut the engine reluctantly, and in the sudden silence Alice's voice rang out, sharp with disbelief. Karen responded calmly, as if she had anticipated this exact confrontation, explaining that the road Alice believed to be her driveway was in fact on her land, that it had never been formally registered as a private access, and that she had secured approval from the county to restore the area to its natural state. Alice protested, insisting that her deed clearly marked the boundaries, that the gravel road had existed for decades and was the only access to her property, but Karen only lifted a folder of papers, crisp and official-looking, claiming they confirmed her rights. She even gestured toward the workers, telling them to continue, her tone making it clear she considered Alice's objections irrelevant. In that moment, Alice felt a peculiar kind of helplessness, the kind that comes when authority is wielded not by law but by confidence and showmanship. She tried to grab at the folder, but Karen stepped back with exaggerated offense, saying loudly that trespassing on her documents could be considered interference with county operations. The workers exchanged uncertain looks, then started the bulldozer again, and the blade bit deeper into the ground, tearing away not only gravel but the packed soil beneath. Alice's driveway, the very path that connected her home to the world, was being destroyed before her eyes. She shouted again, threatening to call the police, but Karen's reply was swift and unnervingly precise. She said she had already spoken with the sheriff's office and provided them with the county's approval notice, so any complaint would be dismissed. As a misunderstanding of jurisdiction, the certainty in her tone made Alice hesitate, because though she knew her claim was legitimate, she had not yet gathered the evidence to prove it. By noon, the driveway was unrecognizable, a scar of churned dirt and broken stone stretching where her access road had once been. The workers packed their equipment. Karen thanked them graciously as if they had performed a public service, and within an hour only silence remained, broken occasionally by the creak of gravel under Alice's shoes as she walked the ruined path in. Disbelief. She tried to call the county office immediately, but the receptionist spoke in a monotone, repeating that according to their files the road was listed as inactive and subject to removal under an environmental rehabilitation grant. Alice demanded to know who had submitted the application, but the receptionist could only say that it had been filed by a local coordinator, and when Alice pressed for a name, the woman simply repeated that she had no authority to disclose. Personnel information? The call ended abruptly, leaving Alice staring at her phone in growing anger. That evening, while pacing in the kitchen, Alice sifted through her father's old papers again, searching for anything that might clarify the ownership of the road. She found tax receipts dating back decades, all referencing the parcel number that included the driveway, as well as a hand-drawn map he had kept folded in a drawer, showing the gravel path as part of the lot. It was clear to her that Karen's claim was false, yet the destruction was already done. Without the driveway, her property was effectively cut off. Deliveries would be impossible. Visitors would find it difficult to reach the house, and worse, in heavy rain the torn ground could turn to impassable mud. The violation was not just legal, but physical, a severing of her connection to the outside world. 2 days later, determined not to let the matter rest, Alice drove into town and requested access to the county planning records. The clerk, a balding man with glasses that slid constantly down his nose, pulled up the file on his computer and frowned slightly, telling her that according to their database the driveway had been decommissioned years earlier and classified as abandoned infrastructure. Alice pointed out that it had been in use until only yesterday, but the clerk only shrugged, muttering that sometimes the records took precedence over practical reality. When she demanded to see the original documents, he produced a scanned set of forms bearing what looked like Karen's signature as the applicant and a county official's approval stamp. Alice studied the pages in disbelief. The justification cited was restoration of unused roadway to reduce erosion risks. And attached was a photograph of the gravel path looking strangely neglected, as though the image had been altered or deliberately staged to make it appear derelict. Walking out of the office, Alice felt the air heavy on her chest. It was no longer a dispute between neighbors. It was an institutional betrayal, a system that had accepted Karen's narrative without question and acted on it with devastating consequences. She returned home to find a new development. A wooden stake with bright orange ribbon had been driven into the soil at the edge of her property, marked with spray paint symbols she did not understand. When she confronted Karen again, the woman's response was chilling in its composure. She said that the county planned to reclaim certain parcels of unused land for environmental purposes, that Alice's father had failed to file updated paperwork after zoning changes years ago, and that she was simply helping the county complete what should have been done long ago. She added, with an unmistakable trace of satisfaction, that perhaps Alice was not prepared for the responsibility of maintaining such a property and might consider selling it to someone more suited. It was in that moment Alice understood the true nature of what she was facing. This was not about erosion, not about nature or county programs. It was about possession, about erasing her claim one step at a time until she had no choice but to surrender. The catalyst had been set in motion with the roar of a bulldozer, but beneath it pulsed something older and more deliberate, a neighbor's determination to rewrite the land's history for her own gain, and a county's willingness to look the other way. Alice could not simply accept the destruction of her driveway as an irreversible fact, though the wreckage outside her home seemed to insist otherwise each time she stepped onto the churned soil where gravel had once formed a steady path. The bulldozer tracks remained pressed into the ground like scars, and each morning she felt a tightening in her chest when she looked at them, a reminder that her access to her own house could be taken so easily by someone who believed authority came from persistence and audacity. The first step, she decided, was to obtain indisputable proof that the driveway belonged to her and had always been recognized as part of her property, no matter what manipulated records Karen had managed to insert into the county's files. She hired a licensed surveyor, a tall, quiet man named Robert Heller, who carried his equipment with the calm confidence of someone who trusted only in measurements and mathematics. Over the course of 2 long afternoons, Robert walked the perimeter of her property, setting up tripods, stretching bright lines across the earth, taking readings with an expression of concentration so deep that it seemed to shut out the rest of the world. When he finally sat down with Alice in her kitchen, he laid out the results on large sheets of paper, the boundaries clearly marked, the driveway unmistakably contained within her parcel. His tone was firm but not dramatic. There was no ambiguity, no overlap, no uncertainty. The road was hers, and legally there should never have been any question. Armed with the survey, Alice approached the county office again, this time refusing to be brushed aside. She demanded that the clerk compare the new findings with their existing records, and though the man fidgeted and insisted he was not authorized to make determinations, the contradiction between Robert's precise data and the vague, poorly documented forms already on file was undeniable. Instead of admitting the error, however, the clerk told her to take the matter up with the zoning board, a committee that met only once a month. The implication was clear. Any correction would be slow, and in the meantime the destruction of the driveway remained unaddressed. Frustration burned in Alice's stomach as she realized the system was designed not for swift justice, but for procedural delay. And in that delay, Karen's version of reality could settle in like dust after demolition. When Alice confronted Karen directly with the survey maps, spreading them out on the hood of her car so the older woman could see every line and measurement, Karen's reaction was unsettling in its calmness. She studied the papers with a faintly amused smile, then remarked that surveys can be challenged, and that counties often update their records to reflect reality rather than outdated assumptions. The words were slippery, spoken with the assurance of someone who had spent years twisting narratives until they fit her intentions. When Alice raised her voice, accusing her of orchestrating a fraudulent project, Karen tilted her head and said softly that she should be careful with accusations, because slander could be just as costly as property disputes. Then she walked away, leaving Alice trembling with a mixture of rage and disbelief. The next escalation came not from Karen directly, but from a notice delivered by certified mail 3 days later. It was a complaint filed against Alice with the county safety department, alleging that she had created a hazardous condition by attempting to reconstruct an unapproved roadway without permits. The language was sterile, bureaucratic, but the weight of it was devastating. If upheld, the county could fine her, restrict her property use, or even place a lien. Alice had done nothing more than hire a surveyor and mark the land with flags, yet the complaint framed her as a reckless owner endangering the environment. She recognized Karen's hand in every word, the precision of the accusations, the way they mirrored phrases Karen had used in conversation about erosion and safety. The realization that her neighbor could not only tear apart her driveway but also weaponize the county against her filled Alice with a gnawing dread that reached beyond the physical dispute into her very sense of security. Determined not to be silenced, Alice sought legal advice. She found an attorney, Michael Grant, who specialized in property law, and after reviewing the survey, the deed, and the complaint, he confirmed what she already knew. Her ownership was legitimate, but his explanation of the road ahead was sobering. Legal resolution could take months or even years, requiring hearings, appeals, and endless paperwork. In the meantime, Karen could continue her campaign, filing complaints, stirring up officials, and exploiting the inertia of the system to pressure Alice into giving up. Michael advised her to document everything meticulously, every letter, every conversation, every photograph of the destroyed road, and to prepare for a long battle. His words were practical, but as Alice walked out of his office clutching a folder of legal documents, she felt the heavy loneliness of someone stepping into a fight that would consume her life. The strain began to seep into her days in unexpected ways. Deliveries that once reached her easily now refused to come down the torn driveway, leaving packages at the far end of the property. Heavy rains turned the path into deep ruts of mud that clung to her boots, and one evening her car became stuck halfway to the gate, forcing her to trek through the muck with grocery bags cutting into her hands. Each inconvenience was a reminder of Karen's victory, not just in destroying the road, but in making Alice's life less livable, her home less viable. Friends who had promised a visit canceled, unwilling to navigate the mess, and though Alice did not say it aloud, she began to sense the isolation pressing closer with each day. The most chilling moment came when she returned home late one evening and found a new wooden sign hammered into the ground where her driveway had once begun. The letters were stenciled in black paint, stark and officious. Unauthorized access prohibited. County Project Zone. No one had asked her permission to place it, and yet it stood there as if the land no longer belonged to her. She tore the sign down with shaking hands, but the act brought no relief, only the realization that Karen's influence reached far enough to brand her property with official-looking symbols that neighbors might believe without question. The escalation had shifted from physical destruction to psychological warfare, and Alice understood that her opponent was not interested in compromise. The goal was clear: to erase her claim entirely, to make her presence on the land untenable until she had no choice but to leave. Alice's life had become an exhausting sequence of consultations, phone calls, and restless nights spent staring at papers spread across her kitchen table, but the more she tried to push back against Karen's encroachment, the more she felt that she was battling shadows, an opponent who never struck directly but always through institutions, paperwork, and ambiguous language that drained her time and her energy. The surveyor's report and her deed, which should have been irrefutable, seemed to melt into irrelevance each time she presented them at the county office, where clerks responded with rehearsed politeness and vague promises to review the case. The notices in the mail continued, each stamped with bureaucratic certainty, each insinuating that she was the one violating regulations, not the neighbor who had ordered a bulldozer onto her land. What unsettled her most was the realization that Karen did not need to win in any definitive legal sense. She only needed to create enough confusion and procedural delay to destabilize Alice's grip on her property, to make her life unlivable until she surrendered out of exhaustion. In an effort to cut through the fog, Alice began filing her own information requests, leveraging her right to access county records under the Freedom of Information Act. The responses were slow to arrive, sometimes heavily redacted, but one thick envelope delivered on a rainy afternoon contained a revelation that changed the complexion of the fight entirely. Inside were copies of the grant applications Karen had filed to secure county funds for the so-called restoration project. Reading through them, Alice's stomach twisted with disbelief. The documents described her driveway not as a private access road but as an abandoned public right-of-way that posed environmental risks due to erosion and improper drainage. Attached photographs portrayed the gravel strip in a state of disrepair that was almost unrecognizable. Dark patches of soil where gravel had been deliberately scraped away, water pooled to mimic damage, weeds uprooted and scattered to look like invasive growth. It was a staged ruin, constructed with intent and submitted as evidence to obtain taxpayer money. The signature on the application was Karen's, but what startled Alice even more was the name listed beneath as the county project manager, a man she had never heard of, whose office was located not in Seldwell but in a neighboring county. When she called the number on the form, the receptionist told her brusquely that he was unavailable and no one else could comment on past grants. The line went dead before Alice could press further. The dismissal was so abrupt that it left her staring at the phone in silence, a chill settling into her bones. There was something larger at play here, something that reached beyond the petty malice of a controlling neighbor. The county had approved funds on the basis of fraudulent information, and Karen had positioned herself not as a private individual, but as a coordinator of a government-sanctioned project. Desperate for clarity, Alice took the file to Michael Grant, her attorney, and laid the documents across his desk. He read in silence, eyebrows knitting as he turned each page, then finally leaned back with a low whistle. What he explained made Alice's heart sink. By framing the driveway as an abandoned public asset, Karen had tapped into a state-level program designed to reclaim unused infrastructure for ecological restoration. A program flush with funds, but notorious for loose oversight. The county had no reason to scrutinize the claim too closely because it came with financial incentive. And once the application was approved, the destruction of the road carried the appearance of legitimacy. Michael admitted that while the evidence of staging was strong, proving intent in court would be difficult without direct testimony or additional records, and in the meantime, the county could hide behind the excuse that it was acting in accordance with state policy Alice left his office with the heavy sense that she was walking through a maze where every corridor turned her back toward Karen's house, the two-story structure now looming in her mind as a fortress from which her neighbor orchestrated silent assaults. The psychological strain deepened when she noticed new wooden stakes planted along her property line, each topped with colored ribbons and spray-painted codes she did not understand. She photographed them, sent the images to Michael, and received his terse reply: they looked like markers for soil assessment. Whether legitimate or not, they carried the authority of officialdom, and Alice knew that to neighbors passing by they created the impression that her land was under some sort of sanctioned review. The narrative of her as an irresponsible landowner was being constructed piece by piece, not through confrontation, but through the slow layering of appearances. It was during one of her late-night searches through her father's old files that Alice stumbled upon something that shifted her perspective yet again. In a metal box labeled simply Property Historic, she found a yellowed letter addressed to him from the Department of the Army, dated nearly 40 years earlier. The letter acknowledged his request to retain access to the driveway because beneath it ran a decommissioned communication cable, part of a Cold War-era network that, while no longer in use, remained technically federal property. The letter explicitly warned that no excavation should be conducted without federal review, as tampering with the line could pose risks to safety and interfere with undisclosed systems. Alice read the letter 3 times, her heart pounding faster with each pass. If the cable still existed beneath her land, then Karen's bulldozing had not only destroyed her driveway but also violated federal restrictions. The next morning, Alice drove into the county seat carrying the letter in a protective sleeve, determined to present it to the zoning board as irrefutable proof that her land had unique restrictions. Yet, when she arrived, the board's clerk glanced at the letter with visible disinterest, muttering that the document was outdated and irrelevant. When Alice insisted, the clerk finally relented and placed a call to a supervisor who arrived in a gray suit and read the letter with careful eyes. His expression tightened almost imperceptibly, but instead of acknowledging the seriousness, he told Alice she should leave the matter alone for her own sake. The tone in his voice, controlled but edged with warning, sent a chill through her spine. She walked out of the office trembling, realizing that her discovery had touched something officials preferred not to revisit. That evening, as rain hammered against her windows and the ruined driveway turned to mud outside, Alice sat alone in the kitchen staring at the Army letter beside the fraudulent grant application. The two documents together painted a picture of conflict not just between neighbors but between personal rights and institutional convenience. Karen had exploited bureaucratic neglect to secure funds, but in doing so she had trampled over federal restrictions, and now the county seemed complicit in downplaying the violation rather than admitting fault. The midpoint of Alice's struggle had arrived, not with clarity but with the dawning awareness that the fight was deeper, more dangerous, and more isolating than she had ever imagined. The discovery of her father's letter had given Alice a fragile sense of leverage, a small thread of hope that the destruction of her driveway might yet unravel into something larger than Karen had anticipated. But, as the days unfolded, she realized that hope was not a shield against the persistence of her neighbor's campaign. What had begun as the loss of a road was now spiraling into a coordinated effort to portray her as the intruder on her own land, and every attempt to assert her rights seemed to trigger a new wave of accusations, paperwork, and manipulations. The stakes were no longer about convenience or property lines. They were about survival in an environment where appearances mattered more than truth and where Karen had the patience to grind her down one calculated step at a time. The first blow came in the form of an official complaint lodged with the County Environmental Bureau, alleging that Alice had illegally interfered with soil assessments and tampered with county markers. She knew immediately that this referred to the colored stakes she had found near her boundary line, stakes she had photographed but never touched, yet the complaint described her as having removed them to obstruct testing. A fine was threatened, and though Michael assured her it could be contested, the burden of proof was on her to show that she had not interfered. The Kafka-esque reversal, That innocence required evidence while falsehoods required none, settled into her mind like a weight. She began keeping her phone in her pocket at all times, ready to photograph any sign, marker, or intrusion, as if her daily life had become a continuous act of self-defense against invisible accusations. What followed was more personal and far more unnerving. On a cold evening in October, Alice returned home to find her mailbox open and stuffed with leaflets, all printed with the county seal, announcing upcoming hearings about abandoned infrastructure and environmental reclamation projects. The language was broad, but the illustrations were unmistakable. Sketches of gravel roads marked with red X's, paths transformed into grassy fields, case studies of properties that had been successfully rehabilitated for the public good. Her address was not listed, yet the implication was clear. Her home had become the silent example in a campaign designed to normalize what Karen had done. She gathered the leaflets in shaking hands and burned them in her fireplace, but the smell of ink and ash lingered through the night, mixing with the sense that she was being written out of her own story. Michael advised her to escalate in turn, to file her own complaint at the state level, bypassing the county that had already demonstrated its unwillingness to act. Alice agreed, and together they prepared a packet of evidence that included the survey, photographs of the destroyed driveway, copies of Karen's grant applications, and the Army letter warning against excavation. Sending it off felt like hurling a stone into a vast and indifferent lake, the ripples uncertain, but it was the only option left. For a week she waited anxiously, checking the mailbox with a mixture of dread and anticipation, until finally an envelope arrived stamped with the seal of the state auditor's office. The letter inside confirmed receipt of her complaint and promised a review, but the language was measured to the point of sterility, and Alice could not shake the suspicion that the matter might vanish into bureaucratic silence. While waiting for a response, the tension with Karen grew sharper and more immediate. Late one night, Alice noticed lights flickering through her window and stepped outside to see a pickup truck idling at the edge of her property, its headlights trained directly on the scar where her driveway had been. She approached cautiously, heart hammering, but before she reached the gate, the truck pulled away, leaving only the churn of gravel and the acrid smell of exhaust. The incident might have been meaningless, yet the next morning she found fresh tire tracks leading into the mud, stopping just short of her house as though someone had tested how far they could push into her land before being noticed. Fear crept in alongside anger, the realization that the fight was no longer confined to paper and offices. It was bleeding into the nights, into the silence around her home, into the shadows of her daily existence. Then came the subpoena. Delivered by a sheriff's deputy with an apologetic shrug, it ordered Alice to appear in court over Karen's civil suit, alleging harassment, defamation, and interference with a county project. The irony was almost unbearable. Karen had bulldozed her driveway and manipulated county records, yet Alice was being dragged into court as the aggressor. Michael assured her that the suit was weak, built on exaggerations and the flimsiest of claims, but he also warned that the process itself could be punishing, draining her finances and energy in ways Karen would relish. Sitting at her kitchen table that night, Alice realized that Karen's true weapon was not the bulldozer, or even the county's complicity, but the endless escalation. The strategy of forcing her into constant reaction until resistance became unsustainable. Still, Alice refused to retreat. She photocopied every document, backed up every file, stored copies in different places, and began a meticulous log of every encounter, every unexplained incident, every official notice. The ritual gave her a sense of control, however fragile, and reminded her that her father had entrusted her with the land for a reason. She thought often of the Army letter, of the cable buried beneath the soil, a relic of a forgotten network that seemed to mirror her own hidden struggle. Silent, unseen, but carrying a weight that others preferred to ignore. If the county wanted to bury her claim under layers of paperwork, she would dig through each one until the truth was undeniable. If Karen wanted to surround her with appearances, she would counter with substance. The escalation had reached a point where every move mattered, and Alice understood that the fight was no longer about a driveway, but about the right to remain, to exist, to assert her place against the slow erosion of lies. The courtroom was not grand or imposing, just a square space with pale walls, a faint smell of old paper, and rows of wooden benches polished smooth by years of use. Yet, as Alice stepped inside, she felt the weight of every eye upon her. The sense that her entire life had been condensed into this sterile room where narratives were sharpened into arguments, and truth was measured not by clarity, but by procedure. Karen was already there, seated with a lawyer in a dark suit who projected confidence through his every gesture, whispering in her ear with the composure of someone rehearsed in battles like this. Karen herself wore a pearl necklace and a tailored jacket, her posture so straight that it seemed designed to convey authority, as if the simple arrangement of her body could tilt perception in her favor. Alice sat beside Michael, clutching her folder of documents, her hands trembling despite her determination not to show weakness. The case began with Karen's attorney painting Alice as a volatile neighbor who had interfered with a lawful county project, a woman who could not accept that the road in question had been decommissioned years ago, and who had since harassed and defamed his client through baseless accusations. He presented photographs of the driveway after its demolition, arguing that it had been unsafe, prone to erosion, and an eyesore to the community. Each word pressed like a stone on Alice's chest, because it was all untrue, yet dressed in the language of legality it acquired a sheen of plausibility. Karen nodded along with the performance, her expression composed, occasionally glancing at Alice with a faint smile that seemed to whisper, "This is already decided." Then it was Michael's turn, and his voice carried a steadiness that eased the knot. In Alice's stomach, he laid out the deed, the survey, the chain of tax records that confirmed the driveway as part of Alice's property. He held up the Army letter, its faded ink now enlarged on the courtroom projector, and explained that beneath the ground ran federal infrastructure, decommissioned perhaps but never relinquished, and that any excavation required approval that had never been sought. He displayed Karen's grant applications, the photographs clearly staged to exaggerate neglect, and pointed out that public money had been spent not on restoring land, but on destroying private property. The judge leaned forward as he spoke, pen tapping against her notepad, and for the first time Alice saw a flicker of recognition that this was not a trivial neighbor dispute, but a case laced with deception and misuse of authority. The turning point arrived when Robert Heller, the surveyor, took the stand. With calm precision, he explained his measurements, pointing to maps that left no room for ambiguity. His testimony dismantled the idea that the road had ever fallen outside Alice's boundaries. When Karen's lawyer attempted to undermine his credibility, Robert responded with quiet confidence, stating that he had conducted hundreds of surveys over 3 decades, and that the data in this case was as straightforward as any he had ever performed. The simplicity of his certainty cut through the fog of Karen's narrative like a blade. Karen herself was called next, and it was there that the mask slipped. Asked directly why she had applied for funds under the description of an abandoned public road, she hesitated, her gaze flicking toward her lawyer before answering that she had understood it to be public. Pressed further on how she acquired the photographs, she claimed they had been submitted by a contractor, but when asked to produce documentation of this contractor, she faltered. The silence that followed was heavy, and though her lawyer tried to redirect, the damage was done. The courtroom atmosphere shifted subtly but unmistakably, the sense of authority that had surrounded her draining away into doubt. When closing arguments concluded, the judge spoke firmly, declaring that the evidence overwhelmingly favored Alice's claim. The destruction of the driveway was deemed unlawful, the grant applications fraudulent, and restitution was ordered not only for the physical damage but also for the emotional and financial strain inflicted. Furthermore, the matter of misused county funds was referred to the state auditor for investigation. The words echoed through Alice's mind with a clarity that felt unreal, as though she were dreaming of victory after months of struggle. But the gavel struck and the case was decided. Her land was hers again. Karen rose slowly, her face pale, her composure fractured by the judgment. She did not look at Alice as she left the courtroom, her heels clicking sharply against the tile, but the sound carried an edge of desperation rather than triumph. Alice remained seated for a long moment, absorbing the stillness, the sudden absence of tension, the realization that she had endured the onslaught and emerged not just intact but vindicated. The weeks following the verdict passed in a haze that felt both liberating and unreal, as though the rhythm of Alice's days had to learn itself anew after months of siege. The bulldozer scars along the driveway were slowly erased as fresh gravel was laid, the stones catching the light in clean gray lines that seemed to restore not just access but dignity. And each morning when Alice stepped outside, she lingered on the side of the road as if reacquainting herself with something once lost. There were no more trucks idling at her gate, no more anonymous signs planted in the soil, only the quiet return of ordinary life, deliveries arriving without complaint, neighbors waving again as if relieved to acknowledge her openly now that the verdict had clarified the truth. Karen's house, though still standing pristine behind its roses, had fallen into silence. Blinds were drawn more often, curtains closed, and rumor suggested she was preparing to leave the county altogether under the pressure of investigations into her misuse of public funds. Alice did not revel in the downfall, but she could not deny the satisfaction of walking her property without the weight of someone else's claim pressing invisibly against her shoulders. At night, she found herself rereading her father's old letter, the one about the cable beneath the soil, tracing the faded ink with her finger and wondering if he had anticipated that the land would one day test her in ways he could not predict. It struck her that what she had defended was not just a driveway, but a legacy of resilience, a promise that the ground beneath their family home could withstand intrusion so long as someone was willing to stand guard. The ordeal had cost her months of peace, yet in its place she had discovered a deeper strength, the kind that does not roar but endures, and she knew that if ever another challenge came she would not hesitate to meet it. When the last load of gravel was poured, and the contractor told her the road was complete, Alice walked the length of it slowly, feeling the stones crunch beneath her feet, breathing the cool air of the late autumn, and when she reached the gate, she turned back toward the house with a small, steady smile. The land was hers again, and for the first time in many months, so was her life.